appreciate it.
Got things to Mike. Mike's like, I have lived in Beverly.
Good evening,
I had no idea there was Coast Guard.
ladies and gentlemen, counselors.
And they're selling.
Call to order this June 6th meeting of the City Council Subcommittee on Finance and Property and Committee of the Whole. Interesting. We have this evening Commissioner Collins, who will be speaking to us about public services, its full scope, as well as enterprise funds associated with, particularly with public services. We also have, excuse me, we also have this evening our Finance Director, Brian Ailes, and Assistant Finance Director, Amit Chiani, and our Budget Analyst, Jerry Perry. So good evening and welcome to everyone. We have the digital budget screen up and running, I'm glad to see. So why don't we jump right into it. Mr. Collins, good evening. Welcome.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
You bet. As you know, the digital budget has, for all the various different departments, including yours, a sort of a general statement of, organizational chart and so forth. Would you like to make any sort of introductory comments in general before we start talking about questions and so forth?
Sure. Just thanks for having me back. This will be going into my 23rd budget year. Enjoyed every minute of it. So I appreciate that, and I just want to take just a moment to remember that it is June 6th, the 79th anniversary of D-Day, and I want to just remember my grandfather was floating out in the ocean somewhere on a USS Arcturus, and the tens of thousands of Allied troops who were having one of the worst days of their lives today. So,
yeah. Thank you for that remembrance. Unless you'd like to say something more specific in particular about public services, I'll open it up to questions about public services from members of the Finance and Property Subcommittee. Council President has a conflict. She'll be running a little bit late. My understanding is the mayor has a similar conflict. He will also be showing up a little bit later as well. Councilor St. Hilaire, would you like to open with any questions or comments?
Yeah, I guess just to start, Commissioner Collins, I think you do a great job, you and your team, so thank you. You're very responsive. I think as we've talked with other department heads, helping us get back to constituents is very, important to us, so we do appreciate that. I had a specific question, I guess, regarding the snow and ice budget from this year. Where did we end up? It was a pretty mild winter. What happens with those funds? Is any of that available? How does that get budgeted and
we
spent?
came pretty close to nailing it on the head this year. Somewhat of a death by paper cut year, where there's a lot of small storms that were long duration, which are the worst for us. It's tough on the equipment, tough on the staff, and we can't just ignore it. We'd love to ignore it and plow it at the end, because it's not enough snow to really do much with, 2 or 3 inches. But they end up being very expensive because we have to salt our way through the storm, which is an expensive way to manage it, but we have to keep the roads safe throughout the storm. So we ended up pretty much nailing it right on the head. And not ending up, even though it seemed like a mild winter, there was a lot of these small storms throughout the winter. Not a whole lot of plowing, but a whole lot of salting.
Okay, so that helps, thank you. And I don't know, Mr. Chairman, if it's appropriate to get into road and sidewalks discussion at this point, or more specific to the budget.
Yeah, well, let me make a suggestion, excuse me, that maybe we try to go through the organizational chart and ask Commissioner Collins to talk about each one of the various different parts of his
Sure.
organization. And so highway and building maintenance, I guess, is one of them. So we could, start with that and sort of walk through, mindful that other councils want to have a crack at
Yeah,
questions as well.
absolutely. I don't want to monopolize the
But
conversation.
if we want to start with that, go ahead.
with road and sidewalks.
Yeah,
So I guess just Commissioner Collins, you know, we've been talking a lot about this topic over the last year. I guess regarding the budget approach this year to sort of have it be a cash transfer from free cash and not be part of the budget, does that change anything about how you think about road and sidewalk repair or what we can expect from that?
I don't think necessarily the mechanism of the funding changes us tremendously. It just makes, we still have the same conversations. We're in close contact with the finance director and the mayor over what we hope it can be. But until the numbers settle out, we're never sure exactly what's going to be. But we prepare a few different contingency plans depending on. We can adjust the scale of our program up or down depending on what the final number is. So I don't think it matters necessarily to us in the planning effort as to how exactly it's funded, whether it's a free cash transfer, whether it's a appropriation, or sometimes we, like this year, we had this winter repair money that came after the winter from the state level. So we'll take the money from anywhere, but and we can spend it, we can scale up or down pretty quickly.
Thank you.
sure. Yeah, so I'll actually ask about engineering and that aspect of public services, and other members, before we're done, hopefully we'll cover the entire organization of public services by our questions. So could you just speak to what is, what sort of recap what's happened this past year in the engineering department and going forward this coming year? What you sort of are focusing on in terms of goals for that department?
Well, a few months ago, with the council's cooperation, we reorganized some of the management of public services in general, and that led to just some personnel changes internally within engineering. If you're asking about engineering specifically,
Yes.
so it led to some changes within engineering specifically. So now, for the first time in the city's history, we have Lisa Chandler as a female leader of our engineering division. She's a highly competent engineer with a lot of experience. And we are striving to, we've invested in a number of different programs over a decade or more, trying to build up citywide initiatives. Things like you see the Central Square program, where we're trying to that was driven through the engineering division, trying to get the entire city onto one platform for permitting and for document management. The enterprise asset management program is being driven through the engineering division as well, and that's going to help us, again, put all of the city divisions, water, sewer, drain, buildings, everything onto one platform for managing assets throughout the city, small and large. Swings on playgrounds to, air conditioners on roofs, rooftops. So we've been retuning the staff in the engineering department to fit that mission. And it's become a very highly technical staff that we have there, very capable, and, they've done tremendous work in retooling those things. And there's a lot more to come. We're just starting to see the fruits of a lot of years of labor. These things take a long time. We've been digitizing records for 15 years. We've been building databases and building out some of these programs. So that stuff's just now really becoming useful to us on a day-to-day basis. In fact, in 10 days, our asset management program goes live for the end users to start inputting data on. So it's a lot of exciting times right now.
And you alluded to some of the changes. You now have an assistant building commissioner, Eric Barber, if I got the title right. And going forward, what will be his primary function or role in the department?
So Eric, I've not had an assistant in my career, actually anywhere. So Eric will be, the assistant to me to help me run these programs so that I can focus more on the mission statement type projects that we do, and Eric can be more of the running the projects themselves and making sure that the day-to-day dotting the i's and crossing the t's gets done. So he's going to be more boots on the ground running those projects for us, and managing the projects. We're trying to empower the foremen to be more capable on their own, so that they require less day-to-day oversight, but the large-scale projects that are number in the hundreds will be, Eric will be running most of those.
Okay, thank you. I have other questions, but I also want to allow other counselors outside the subcommittee to have a chance to ask questions. Councilor Rotundo.
Thank you. Mr. Collins, mine's about sanitation. I know we just signed a contract, but we saw Danvers recently sign a contract going to every other week with recycling, as well as looking towards automation. I know our contract's in a couple of years, but the reality is we're seeing the increase in sanitation, tipping fees, and the fees itself. This does sort of fall under the engineering department. Is this something that would be considered for this city? And again, I know it's a year or 2 years out, but again, I think it's something we should start looking at, is how can we save money? I mean, recycling no longer is the commodity that it used to be. It's actually costing us money to have it recycled. From what I've read and understand, Danvers, they've gone to every other week of doing recycling, and there's considerable savings with that. Is there any thought to that?
Yeah, it wasn't that many years ago that we were every other week, and we went to every week to try to increase our recycling tonnage. It's hard to say where the market will be when our contract expires, so it's still the right thing to do to try to divert as much tonnage as possible from landfills and incinerators. We're hoping that the marketplace changes, because we are definitely in for sticker shock when that time comes, because we're going to be paying a lot more for recycling in the future than we do now. Recycling is poised we'll be paying a lot more to recycle something than we would to landfill it in the future, unless something changes about the marketplace. Right now, it's still a lot cheaper for manufacturers to buy virgin plastic than it is to buy recycled material to make anything out of plastic. So the lesson there is don't buy plastic, but that's not, hasn't really sunk in the out there in the general population yet. So anything and everything's on the table. Financially, we need to brace for impact, because it's going to be a big hit to the city in a few years. So I think everything needs to be on the table as we look to the next contract. The marketplace is vastly different than it was with JRM getting bought out, because now it's mostly large, very large national firms that have a presence here, and that just changes how you negotiate, and it changes what they're willing to do, and it's sort of the corporate world of trash now. But in 3 years, there could be another family business that pops up. That's sort of the cycle of how that business goes. Somebody will start another local trash company, and hopefully there'll be a real player. We'd much prefer to deal with a local, I wouldn't say that. It's great to be able to deal with a local family, to know that that money's going to stay in the local economy and whatnot. We don't have anything against the national firms. It's just, it's a different negotiating tactic. So, I mean, there's a lot that's going to be different when we look at it. Danvers did end up staying with Republic. They were with Republic, and they stayed with them. So, we'll see. I mean, it's all on the table, though.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all.
Okay. Councilor Rand.
Thank you. I wanted to kind of go back a little bit to the highway, the highway division. And I wanted to ask about there's one well, there are many vacancies, but there's the heavy motor equipment operator vacancy. And I noticed in your notes that that doesn't say, would you'd like to fill that ASAP? So I thought I'd ask you about that. I do see that in the special heavy motor equipment operator, you have those positions, your notes say you'd like to fill those as soon as possible. I'm wondering what the likelihood of you filling all three of those are.
I would love to, if you know anyone, please encourage them to apply. You know, for the lowest level positions, we're willing to train people, we're just not getting applicants. You know, like for instance, a heavy motor equipment operator, everyone in our staff has a CDL, commercial driver's license, which is not easy to get. And the federal government, in their infinite wisdom, in the middle of a supply chain crisis, made it harder to get, which I thought was awesome. So what we tell people, if they come to us and they're a good candidate, we ask them to go get their permit, which anybody can do. Anybody can go get a CDL permit. Getting the license and the road test is a whole different ballgame. We offer the training in-house, and we'll sponsor the candidate as long as they can pull it off in the first 6 months of a probationary period. So we try to make it easy, as you know, for a good candidate. We try to make it easy to come here, because if you just wanted to get a CDL on your own, it could cost you upwards of $10,000 to get one at one of the commercial tractor trailer schools. So that's a big benefit, and you've got that as long as you maintain it. You've got that forever. It makes you very valuable, especially now.
Can I have a follow-up
please.
question? A couple of follow-up questions to that. Do you work with the high school at all in their career days to sort of talk about these career paths and training opportunities?
We have interns. I don't know that we've been involved in the career days specifically. We do, we have a constant supply of interns locally, but I've not participated in the career days.
I wonder if that would, if you can specifically speak about your training opportunities, that might be just another way to get people interested. When these positions are advertised, do they clearly say that there are training opportunities?
No, but that doesn't seem, I don't think it does, but that doesn't seem to, you know, most people are looking for a city job, you know. When they apply, they just blindly apply, not looking for anything in particular, and we try to look for people who have some relevant experience. If you've never worked outdoors, it's probably not the job for you, because that's all we do.
Right.
So, you know, you can pretty quickly tell somebody who can be made into a, you know, truck driver, equipment operator. It's just,
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is my opportunity, and I think I say this every year, but I would love to see sort of more of a system for you to feed into your vacancies, so that and I
Yeah.
know you would too. I also know that you have a knack for choosing somebody who's super talented and will stay here for a long time, but I definitely would support you sort of branching out into what that feeder
Yeah,
system
I
looks
don't-
like.
I'm not afraid to try anything. I think the challenge right now is nobody's applying for jobs anywhere. It's, you know, the workforce has somehow disappeared. So
It's a
when
strange
when the
time.
aliens bring everyone back from wherever they took them, I think that'll be a good day, because it's not just me. You know, jobs of all flavors and all colors are going unfilled right now.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there are jobs unfilled, but then also you hear about people submitting thousands of applications and never even getting a response back. So it's a strange time, for
Yeah,
sure.
in the corporate world, it's awful, because it's all automated, and you can't get through the automated bots.
Yeah.
So I don't envy anyone that's looking for a job in the private sector right now, because they've broken that system fairly well. So,
Aliens.
yes, could blame it on the aliens.
I have
Go ahead.
another question. I think this is also actually in the highway division. Can you remind me, what heavy equipment purchase will be made through the capital outlay this year?
Well, we're a little bit challenged there. We had a truck spec'd out, and because of the unique challenges in the supply chain, and again, the federal government making our lives challenging, there's a change in emissions regulations coming in 2024. And when we tried, so we spent many months working on a spec for a truck, and when push came to shove, we recently found out that we can't order the truck because the body that goes on the truck can't go into production until 2024. The manufacturer of the chassis doesn't have an engine that complies with the 2024 emissions, so they can't place the order. So we're sort of stuck. So we were trying to buy a bucket truck, which we need, but we're changing tack and trying to order a dump truck instead, because hopefully we can get that under the 2023 emissions chassis. It's things that we did not think would happen.
Okay.
The supply chain, despite what you hear on the radio, is absolutely 100% still broken.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good update. And then I have two more questions.
Go ahead.
One is, where do we see the asset management program? Like, what line item does that fall under?
I think, some of that was stuck under IT.
It's split between the water fund, the sewer fund, and the general fund, because those are the primary functions it supports. The general fund portion is contained within the IT department budget.
Okay, thank you. And my last question is on the sanitation portion of your budget. The 4.6% increase, is that just a reflection of the new contract?
I think it's a 5%, but it all shakes out, yeah.
Okay. That was I feel like.
Contractual increase is 5%.
Okay.
But the other factors made it look like 4.6.
Okay, and that's, what are the years for that contract again?
I think we have 3 more years, I think.
FY '24 is the third year of 5, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Before we leave Councilor Rand's questions, I'd just like to follow up on the sidewalk program for a moment. The 2 questions. One is, driving here this evening and seeing the new concrete poured out in front of City Hall, which contains many of the features of sort of the other section of Cabot Street, but doesn't appear at the moment to have sections of brick interlaid with the concrete, like so much of the rest of Cabot Street does, that was done earlier. Is that going to change, or are we just not including that in this section of the?
There are some sections that haven't been built yet that will have some brick detail in it.
Okay. And second question, we still have many occasions in the city where repairs are done to sidewalks for various different reasons, a broken water junction box or something like that, where the section of the sidewalk that has been broken up to do the repairs ends up being filled with asphalt as opposed to concrete. Is that a policy? What drives what when you get asphalt there, and if it's not a policy, why do we end up with that?
So it's not just us too, it's the gas company digging it up, because we got an email today from one of the residents of Ward 2, asking, says, hey, somebody dug up in front of my house and put asphalt back there in the winter, because it's winter. Because, sometimes you can't, you don't have the choice, the weather forces your hand. Very often what we're looking to do is we're looking to make it right, and make it safe right away. And then the smallest truckload of concrete you can get is 4 yards, without paying an exorbitant short load fee, 4 cubic yards of concrete. So we'll tend to gather up these spots and then go out, maybe once a month or once a quarter even, depending on how many we have, and do those 1 square spots all over the place, because then we can pay, buy that 4-yard truck and go out and do a whole bunch of spots. So it's the asphalt we can get any day. It's easy to get, and it's easy to make the repair and make the sidewalk whole and safe until we can get there. And do the slab properly. So we do go back and chase them.
And so as a ward counselor where I get requests or questions about that, what's the best way to feed information back to your department or the highway division to make sure that?
It's fine to either, it's fine to either put it in QSEN, or if you want to email myself or Lou Grasso as the foreman directly, that's fine too. He's got a list, so we know where they are, he's constantly gathering them up. And, sometimes we end up with a concrete pour that, for whatever reason, he says, well, I got a whole bunch of onesie-twosie things, maybe the tree stumps even, that we gotta go pull and do some concrete repairs. So he's always got a list growing of those little small sidewalk repairs like that we're looking to try to get enough work to do a whole day worth of pours.
So reach out to the head of the highway division for that?
You could directly, or if you want, you can always put it in QSEN,
Okay,
that way, those get routed right to him.
okay, all right, thank you. Other questions from other counselors? Counselor Sweeney, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Collins, for taking the time to be here. Starting with staffing, I'm glad to see that you've created this assistant commissioner position that Eric Barber has stepped into. He did a great job as city engineer, and I know when he was in that role, he talked a lot about some of the projects he'd like to take on but didn't have the time as the engineer. So I think that's great that there will be more project management capacity at the top of your department. And I'm excited to see the Central Square software get up and running. I think that'll help as well. But on that end, if you ask any department in City Hall, I'm sure they could all say that they could use extra staff, given the need outweighing the number of people available to do the work. But generally posing that question to you, now that you've added capacity in the project management role that sounds like Eric's going to be taking on as assistant commissioner, are there other areas, whether it's within any of the specific divisions that you oversee or at the department head level, where you feel as though the need for additional staff capacity is really greater than some of the other areas? Any in particular?
I think across the board, I would desperately love to fill all these vacancies because, there's a very small crew in the water shop, and if anyone tries to take a vacation or do anything, we could be shorthanded, which we're prepared for because we fill in with the rest of the divisions. So we can bring labor over from other divisions and help out, which we do all the time, especially at night on a water break, which, knock on wood. So it's well supported, but it's taxing for the staff to be so shorthanded. That's a pretty tough job. It's always outside, it's always cold and wet, and it's demanding work. Not that the other divisions aren't, but people get scared away from the water work, I think. They get afraid of it a little bit. So we could really use some help there, which will then, because right now, the staffing we have is demanding that the foreman be heavily involved in the day-to-day with the crew, which takes away from the foreman's time to do all of the things that a foreman needs to do. So that burden then trickles up to me and to Eric, that we have to take on some of that administrative burden, because that lowest level labor shortage is pushing some of that administrative work up to us. So that's why it's across the board we need help. The changes we made administratively recently, having Eric, when we're able to fill in some of the lower level positions, the assistant city engineer, things like that, and Eric's able to divorce himself more from the engineering day-to-day grind and fully hand over all the projects, then, that'll help me be more attentive to some of the larger projects that we take on as a city. And because there's a tremendous amount of my day that is eaten up by just replying to residents and answering questions that we do, and that's all great. I mean, it's some of the best part of the job, frankly, is the one-on-one. I'm sure you guys all see that as counselors too. But it takes time. It takes time away from the larger projects. And then creating the business manager role, and then being able to fill that administrative assistant, which we're about to start interviews on, will administratively within the public services department will really help out, just with some of the day-to-day of the management of everything. So across the board, if we could just fill those lowest level jobs, that believe it or not, that's a tremendous help to us. We're getting more done at that point, which means you're getting fewer questions because things are getting done. But, you know, there's no level. I look at what, like, if I look at engineering, I look at what engineering was 20 years ago, and they were asked to do so little. They did a lot. They were great staff. But the mission was so much smaller. It has expanded exponentially over the last 10 or 15 years. And every day we think like, wow, we've got a lot more people here. We're doing a lot more. We could use more staff there because, you know, Eric and I were talking today of the amount of data and GIS work that we do. Like, just for instance, a town on the Brookline has, I think, 5 or 7 staff. GIS only. It's, you know, it's such an important part of what the city does. It's hard for a lot of people to, it's one of those things where if you're building a house, there's so much that get buried in the house that you never see and you don't appreciate. GIS is one of those things that's sort of buried in the house and nobody appreciates, but it's so critical to what we do and how we manage everything. And it helps us with data analysis. It is a data analysis tool. Helps us manage things. So I don't think there's a facet where we couldn't use more help, but, you know, as we've done since the beginning of time, we'll do the best we can with what we have.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful to understand where the needs lie, and it sounds like it's the organizational structure set. It's just a matter of filling open positions.
Even when they're all filled, you know, we could still use more help. You know, years ago, I discovered an organizational chart from the 70s of the city, of the DPW, with over 200 employees. And that didn't include school staff. You know, we're about 100 right now. That includes engineering, motor pool, school custodians, everything. And they were 200 plus laborers. So it's not like it used to be.
Oh, it'd be nice if we could get to that level someday, but that's helpful context. And on roads and sidewalks, I know, Councilor St. Hilaire mentioned it. It's by far the #1 thing that I hear about, and obviously you've discussed this with the council as a whole. The need citywide, it far surpasses the means that we'll ever have annually to put towards roads and sidewalk repair. I appreciate the effort of the administration to at least match previous year's funding through the free cash proposal that we're going to consider. But just so that maybe you can put it into context for those listening, you mentioned supply chain issues, and I know that the cost of materials generally for the road work that you and your team undertake has gone up pretty significantly. I don't know if you have any general numbers available, but could you perhaps summarize what that cost increases looked like over the past few years for what it used to cost to pave a road versus what you're looking at for this coming paving season?
I mean, if I could stretch the timeline back a little bit further, it seemed like for my entire career, pavement was $32 a ton in place, and now it's, between $70 and $80, depending on, we actually have an escalator built into it, so the state publishes a number once a month, and our price that we pay our contractor changes. And that protects both us and the contractor from extreme highs and lows in the marketplace. So it's actually a good thing, even though liquid asphalt which the index is based on, went from $90 to $300+, and actually went up to $900 a ton at one point. It just astronomical increases. We happened to be locked into a contract at that time that we rode that out, and we paid that $32 a ton for a couple of years into that extreme pricing. Other towns had just bid out, so they lost out. That doesn't happen anymore. That's relatively smooth. I will point out that the Chapter 90 program used to be funded, the Transportation Bond Bill used to be $300 million every single year. And since 2004, it's been cut to $200 million. So the state legislature now talks about how, like, oh, great, we were able to keep it at $200,000. I'm like, no, you need to restore it back. So you cut a third of our state funding for paving. And it's now happened so long ago that they've even forgotten that they used to fund citywide paving with, in Beverly's case, another $500,000. So, so we've faced, until the city started adding supplemental funding in the last 10 or so years, we're facing a drastic cut in funding overall. At the same time, prices have basically tripled, is the long-winded answer.
And hopefully anybody in the state legislature is hearing the points that you're making when it comes to Chapter 90. I'm not going to hold my breath. but
They're
about that.
not. In fact, the push at the state level is they'd like to abolish the program altogether, because they think that things like, all the little grant programs, I think that those would replace Chapter 90, but most of the grant programs we're not eligible for. So there's a massive disconnect at the state level that they don't understand. And I don't know how to get through, how to explain that to them any better than this is the best program we have. But
And I appreciate you putting those numbers into context and you guys stretching the dollar in terms of paving as far as you can. One other question that I have, and this will actually be a question for Mr. Perry in terms of, so with the need for roads and sidewalks, the amount of funding that we would actually need to put toward that work far surpassing the amount we have available, I've been trying to look for ways that potentially there could be more funding freed up, which is challenging in a budget as tight as this. And so a question I have for Mr. Perry, which is going to be regarding sanitation. So as Councilor Rotundo mentioned, the costs of both the contract in general, but then the cost of recycling specifically has really gone up significantly. And I know that year over year, the amount of money that we're paying from the general fund towards sanitation has increased at a higher percentage for that reason. The trash fees stayed constant for a number of years. I've talked about this with the mayor. At the end of the day, the taxpayer is going to be footing the bill, whether it's through a trash fee or through their property taxes. So it's, not really making much of a difference in that end. But Mr. Perry, just one question I have for you while we're discussing sanitation within the umbrella of public services. Is there a best practice that you've noticed statewide in terms of how much of the cost of providing trash and recycling services is split between user fees and general fund?
Good evening. Is there a best practice? No, I'm not aware of one. It's kind of a local policy decision to determine how to go about funding that. And I've seen various ways. Some of them are political in nature. Some of them are certainly financial in nature. As we discussed in my memo, about $2.2 million and change, the general fund subsidized the sanitation contract, and we collected about $1.2 million in user fees. It is very politically unpopular to raise user fee. We know that. But as I couldn't help but listen to Mr. Collins, he talked a little bit when these contracts are going to get up, it's going to really get expensive. Is it sustainable to keep growing the general fund subsidy to that? My instincts are no. You can get by with it this year, I guess. But bottom line to it is there a time when we may have to have a conversation about raising the user fees to subsidize sanitation? I think the answer is yes. Maybe that coupled with some aggressive, recycling or whatever it is to reduce tonnage. There's a whole host of stuff in that area too. But bottom line to it, I think at some point you're going to have a conversation about raising the user fees, in my view.
Okay, I appreciate that, and we'll certainly keep that in mind going forward as we try to maintain some sort of long-term commitment to addressing the backlog of needs in roads and sidewalks and making sure that we can put as much money as we possibly can toward addressing that. But that covers all of my questions, so thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay. I want to acknowledge that at some point, the mayor was able to join us this evening, so good evening, Mayor Cahill, as was Council President. Yes, Councilor Bowen.
Thank you.
Questions?
I had a couple of follow-ups on questions that have been asked already, and then I think one new area to ask about. So on the roads and sidewalks theme, I know that you and the mayor have been meeting with councilors and residents for the last few months to set priorities for the funding that's already available and that will be allocated going forward in this budget and potentially in a free cash transfer before the end of the year as well. And so I was just hoping you might unveil that list to us as part of the process?
Is that anything you want to share?
Thank you, Counselor. And Mr. Chairman, couple things. You see that Colin Street is about to get cold planed and then paved. Actually was cold planed last weekend, get paved this weekend. Beckford has been on the, on tap and will get done. We're still working to kind of nail down and perfect this year's program, and I'll share it. We're hoping in the next few weeks to sit with you folks, because we've been working hard, and this is actually something that Mr. Barber has been really kind of pouring some effort into. We're working hard at trying to put together a 3 or longer year plan. And so as we're nailing down this year's work, we want to look ahead a couple of years. It'd be great to look ahead longer than that, but looking to try to find a way to plan ahead. Oftentimes we'll get a road, we're ready to do it, and then we find out that it needs gas infrastructure updates. So trying to look ahead at that more holistically. So tonight, see if there's any others that I know for sure. We're trying to get to do Russell this summer. Russell is the street between the high school, the one way from the high school out to Cabot Street that is heavily used on both high school and middle school, morning and afternoon. So we're trying to do that during the summer months. Beyond that, there are a number of streets kind of in the works. We haven't nailed that down yet. That's in the coming days and weeks, and that's part of what we're going to want to look at with you folks. One more time, right? And I think that's it. So I think that the 3 or better year planning tool that we're trying to put together, and then try to feed in streets based on based on need, and there's plenty of need. And we also have been looking at how to take some of the officially private ways and make them public, so as to make them eligible for rebuilds or resurfacings of those streets. And we all have them, right? There are just about 200 or so of them in town. Surprising when you take a look at that list. So another one that we've been working at how to handle both legally and practically, and ensuring the infrastructure is what it needs to be before taking those streets on. So not all the information you probably want. As I said, Colin, Russell, Beckford, we know they're in process, Cabot in process, the rest we're working on. And I think we'll be looking to sit down with you folks, and maybe a couple of you at a time, to look at that as soon as we can schedule it in later this month. Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And I think it's helpful to hear all that information again, but I think it's difficult for us to move forward, continuing to just sort of get that kicked down the road. I know that the 3-year plan will have to wait a bit for, but for this coming year, I think the small group meetings are helpful. They're not on BevCam for residents to see. This is the time when we have that opportunity to hear what the priorities are and provide any additional input that we might have at this stage. So that is.
I'll give you one more. Hale Street in Beverly Farms, but we can't do it yet because we need to improve the water infrastructure under the street. So, Councilor St. Hilaire, I think we've had that conversation. That stretch of Hale Street from Haskell by Beverly Farms Cemetery back out to 127. So, the rest of what's going to get done this calendar year, will depend on you folks and your vote on the budget, right? Because some of its resources we don't have committed yet. And I hear you people want to know, they want to see. So I think as it becomes clear which ones are getting definitely done this fall or between this fall and next spring, we can share those out via the website.
Thanks. And I hope that people do use the opportunity of our public hearing next week, in the absence of having any list to react to, to just continue to provide their input. It may not be quite as valuable because they won't have the rationale as to why, the street that they bring forward might not be on the list that they haven't seen, but I think still an opportunity for people next week.
And a lot of the program things that I talked about that take a long time and are just starting to bear fruit, you know, some of the things we've been trying to adhere to a pavement management program since 2012, and so we're 10 years into it, and we're starting to build up a data, and we're fine-tuning that tool to the point where we're trying to, our goal as engineers is to make the decision so clear-cut and so transparent that it's easy for everybody, and you get a little bit less of the, you know, squeaky wheel thinking, you know, that doesn't generally work with us. You know, we get lots of petitions about lots of things, and you know, we appreciate it, we don't discount it, but we can't manage by petition. So we feel like we're in a place where we're trying to make that, all the work we've done collecting data and building out this database over the last 10 years will start to bear some fruit and help us be a real management tool. What I was really hoping to do was, over the long term, make the industry smarter by looking at what we have done, being able to look back and see what techniques are the most cost-effective over the long term, which things are making the roads last the longest and getting us the most mileage for it. Because there's nothing green about repaving a road twice in 20 years. We want our roads to last 20, 30 years because we know we really just can't come back to them. We're not going to get back to any particular street within 25 years. That's just not going to happen. There's too many streets, too many miles with the funding levels that we have. So we need to make them last, and that's where our effort's gone, is to trying to make the streets that we do, make them last. The streets we have done, we're trying to make sure that we're putting a lot of effort into pavement preservation so that our investment is protected. So we hope that in the very near future, what we're trying to do now is lay out a longer term. We've built that pavement management tool. We have that gas layer in it. Nobody else has a gas layer in the pavement management tool. So we know what the gas company might be thinking. We know what the age of the water main is in our pavement management tool, so we can start to predict where we might have to go. There's a lot of factors that go into what roads we pave. It's not an exact science. It takes a lot of work. So.
So the other piece that I wanted to follow up on was Councilor Rand's question about equipment. So I think you were describing a purchase that would fall under the fiscal year 24 budget that you're working on now, or that was
It was a 23K.
Okay.
Yeah, 23.
So that was going to be my question, just sort of what total purchases there were in fiscal year 23 or anticipated, because I know you've described sort of waiting until the end of the fiscal year to see where the rest of the budget lands before making those decisions.
I'm sorry, a handful of smaller dumps and pickup trucks.
Sorry, what?
A handful of smaller dump trucks and pickup trucks. It's just been very, very difficult to get anything. We're trying to purchase a larger dump truck, a medium-duty dump truck, because some of the earlier purchases we made there are now starting to rot out. So they're reaching the end of their useful life.
Great, and I know there is a sort of replacement cycle, so can you just share how much of that you were able to do this year and what you're anticipating next year?
With the current funding level, we can buy one truck. Not even really.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like there were a handful, however many that was, of small trucks this past year. Can you just describe that in a little bit more detail? That's more than one, right?
Yeah.
So knowing that's not the full amount that you'd like to be replacing every year.
They're F550, so we call them 1 tons. You know, trying to replace some very, very old 1 tons that are getting on 20 years old. So we tend to keep things for a very long time. We have an excellent motor pool that spends a lot of time refurbishing old equipment, trying to keep it on the road. But that said, you know, you get to the point where you got rust in the firewall, which is a really odd place to rust out, but that's how long we keep trucks. And on the medium duty, the bigger trucks you see in the wintertime plowing or doing our pavement work or hauling gravel, the budget will only sustain, if we bought 1 truck a year, it's over $300,000 now. Everything's become astronomically expensive. So I would say we're not, we don't have sufficient funds to have any sort of a viable replacement schedule. We're kind of always in make-it-work mode.
So the priority for closing out fiscal year '23 was that medium-sized truck.
Yes,
Runs
but...
about 300,000 a year, and our budget was under.
285, I think, so, I mean, the challenge this year is, you know, is not unusual. The public services umbrella is where it's about the only place the city can go in a financial stress point. And this year, we hit a financial stress point with the healthcare costs, so we were asked to not proceed with any large purchases like that. So it's kind of a challenge.
So the 280,000 from this current fiscal year has not been spent, or has been spent on?
We spent some of it, but not a good chunk of it.
And if we were to approve the budget for next year as written, what would that buy us?
One truck. We would endeavor to buy. I still have to buy that bucket truck that we have to retool that, respecify the truck into something else, because the manufacturers literally couldn't build it given the current status of the marketplace. So we're working on revising the specifications for the truck into something that hopefully can be built and procured.
And that could fit within that 280 or so?
Well, no, I mean, that truck would have dressed out at over $600,000, so, one truck.
And how were we planning to pay for that?
Taking funds from several other sources within the department.
Was being unspent staff funds, or?
That's one of the first places we go, but.
Thank you. Then I think the other area that I wanted to ask about that hasn't come up so much yet is the public property budget. If you could talk a little bit about the green initiatives and the design and engineering projects. Again, sort of what we've been able to buy for those budget lines in this current year and what we're anticipating to get out of those in the.
Yeah, so when it comes to financing things like vehicle charging stations and things like that, that's the intent of the green initiative line item. Or if we have a green communities project, there's always a match of some sort with those projects. And I don't know if the mayor wanted to elaborate on that a little.
If you don't mind. Thanks, Mike. Counselor, what I think I'm going to ask you is, Irina Keefe, our sustainability director, put together this year's line, and she tied pretty much every dollar in it to anticipated expenditures. So if we could have her answer that question on Thursday, that would probably be helpful.
Yep.
You know? Okay. Thanks.
And curious about the design and engineering line as well, and whether any of that is supporting the major projects coming up here at City Hall, the McPherson Center, et cetera, or whether those are the smaller projects, the library HVAC,
It tends to be the
fire
smaller
station
things
repairs.
that crop up out of nowhere. You know, it might be a life safety project, it might, or fire alarm design, or you know, there's a lot of little things, asbestos abatement, that we, you know, all we do is manage old buildings, so there's hazardous materials around everywhere. So it tends to be smaller things like that, that we've never had the flexibility to do. So.
And given that there are a number of major projects, or sort of medium-scale projects, and then a couple really big projects in the pipeline with some work beginning next fiscal year potentially, I know the funding for the projects themselves is in capital project funds. It's coming from a number of sources. We'll be borrowing for some of it. But in terms of the impact on what we see in the general fund, that public property budget, and sort of the impact on the staff who connect with all of the project managers and designers, what are you anticipating for that year ahead? And is any of that reflected in this budget? or
Not
is it
in
all
our
built
budget.
in?
You know, the major capital projects, you know, things like the City Hall project, or in the past, the police station or school project, those aren't, you know, those aren't reflected in our budget in any real measurable way. But things like, you know, we just acquired the building across the street, and until we get into a funding stream, then the public properties line item is where we look to. You know, we took over the building, we had to make repairs to the fire alarm system right away. It's gotta come from somewhere. Change the locks on all the doors, it's gotta come from somewhere. So that's tend to where we hit those line items. We had to have the fire alarm system inspected after it was repaired, so we can prove to the insurance company that we are covered for the building. So things like that is, you know, that's the sort of unforeseen that gets handled there. And if we have leftover, we try to stretch it to other smaller projects that aren't necessarily capital type projects that come with a bond authorization or appropriation. You know, something we might try to handle within the budget.
Thank you. I think that's it right now.
Council President, do you have any questions?
I do, thank you. Thank you very much, Commissioner Collins, for being here. I apologize for being tardy to the meeting. So if either of my questions have already been asked, just let me know. And Mr. Chair, and I will go to the BevCam footage to get my answers and not make us all have to rehearse them again, but thank you. I think both of mine are follow-ups to questions that councilors have posed. So Commissioner, my first is following up on Councilor Bowen's questions about the truck purchases. I understand you were saying that some of the purchases have been smaller trucks. Can you just talk a little bit about, are there any trucks in your fleet that are or are able to be, or you're thinking about replacing with electric vehicles at any point? I know heavy equipment, the technology really isn't feasibly there for some of the kinds of trucks that you would be using, but I wasn't sure with some of these smaller trucks if that's a part of your plan.
When I say small, I just mean smaller to us.
Yeah. I was gonna say, help me understand how small is small
Yeah,
and what's
I mean,
possible, if anything.
You know,
for-
these are, you know, GVW of, you know, any pickup truck in the parking lot's gonna be, gross vehicle weight of that's gonna be, you know, 6,000 to 8,000 pounds. We're talking more like 20,000 pounds. So, you know, what you see a typical landscaper pulling a big trailer with, that type of thing, is what, when I say the smaller trucks. And the market, you're right, hasn't really, there are no viable electric alternatives at this time. And I'm not sure that this version of electric vehicles is really gonna get there. The technology has to adapt, and it will adapt. It's gonna get a lot better. But for what we have to do, particularly where there's some big cities that have been able to electrify their fleet, but you know, they have thousands of pieces of equipment, and they can have a whole quiver of electric stuff that just sits off to the side when an emergency happens. We're all hands on deck, so you know, we can't afford to have a set of our fleet that can't actually work. And you know, things like snow removal, that's really tough on batteries because it's cold. You like to keep the windshield warm, so you got to run the heat. And you know, and plus the marketplace, it's not profitable for them to build that stuff yet. It's profitable for them to build $70,000 Teslas. So they build them, and that's what everyone focuses on. And the next thing that'll happen in the truck industry is those last mile, the big box trucks you see, that last mile delivery, you know, 20 to 50, 75 miles a day. They'll go after that. That's low-hanging fruit. And that's great, because that's really going to be impactful to society, especially if you live in a city, if you can get all those little daily delivery trucks on electric. But in our world, it's going to be some time. Having said that, there's a lot of exciting things happening, you know, skid steers, backhoes, things like that are coming out as electric, and some of the smaller tools. We have, I mean, if you look at our hand tools, it's, you know, it's totally battery. It's been battery for years, before it was cool, you know, and, you know, nailers and impact wrenches, and so there's certain segments that have definitely electrified, and certain segments that are a long, long way off. We have tried to buy some vans for some of the tradesmen in our staff, and they're just not available. The manufacturers just tell us that you're not getting one. You know, you can wish all you want, you're just not getting one. One came up for sale, and they wanted a $24,000 premium on it. And that, you know, I just, for the amount of miles we put on, I just don't see it being worth it, honestly. You know, the impact to build that van is we're just not offsetting it yet. It's just not quite there. It will absolutely get there. I'm really looking forward to the technology maturing, you know, solid state batteries and all those things that are, you know, that are coming in our lifetimes, but not quite yet.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And so it sounds, I guess,
Do you
Mayor,
mind if I just add quickly? So we do have an internal policy now that nobody can put a non-EV in front of me for signing without first, you know, kind of checking on where things have been, where things are getting to, and looking to some of these EV manufacturers. I don't love when I sign a PO for a gas or a diesel vehicle, mostly gas, but as Commissioner Collins said, I mean, when they're ready, they're going to be ready, and we're checking with every purchase. Fire chief bought a Ford F-150 last year, EV. It was lemon. Unfortunately, was it really the first model year for that truck by Ford? And they were hoping to, you know, fix some of the snags they were running into with future years. So, you know, we are and we will. And for example, with inspectional vehicles, health and inspectional services, we're not buying anything but EVs moving forward. But on the, you know, as we get to larger equipment, it's about tracking and following. We don't want to misfire, right? We need our fleet to be there for us when we need it, but we're tracking it with every purchase. Thanks.
thank you, I appreciate that. And my other question is a follow-up to some of the questions about the roads and sidewalks, and I don't think that this one was asked. If it is, like I said, please just let me know. I was curious, Commissioner, if you could just elaborate a little bit more on what's the process that determines or dictates, particularly with sidewalks, when roads get a sidewalk treatment that is an asphalt sidewalk, often without curbing, versus the poured concrete with full curbing. I was just curious if those are financial considerations, if it's something about the road itself. Just as examples, I was thinking about, I don't think I'm thinking wrong or remembering wrong. Brimble Ave, I think, is mostly asphalt sidewalk versus Kittredge and Russell, which Russell was referenced here tonight, got full concrete with full curbing, which in some cases, although beautiful and I think really good for the walking to school that happens, presents its own kind of challenge on narrower streets where parking's allowed still on both sides, and maybe we just haven't caught up. But I was just curious about what things dictate the different types of sidewalks that are put along streets, and particularly if it's financial, as we're talking about the budget, I was curious about that.
There's a number of factors. Financial is a significant one, because to, you know, concrete curb, you know, the full show is very expensive. Brimble Ave was being built just as I think it got built just before I started, so that tells you something, in its current configuration. So I think it was 99, and in the spring of 2000, they did the curb and sidewalks there, and they did asphalt berm and asphalt sidewalks, primarily because it would have been there was no curbing out there. It was a massive expenditure to bring in that granite curb. Downtown, the granite curb exists a lot of places, and in those cases, we try to reset it. Recycling is at its finest. We love granite curb because you just keep resetting it over and over again. But it is very expensive. In a place like Russell, we have actually parking and traffic approved moving the parking to one side only. We just haven't caught up with that decision at the ordinances yet, so we haven't presented that to the council yet. So that, since you brought it up.
No, that's helpful, thank you.
But that's a route where it's such a heavily traveled pedestrian route, both by middle school and high school, as the mayor said, that we're looking to try to really formalize the pedestrian accommodations on a street like that. It is a narrow street to begin with, and that's a case there where we are trying to prioritize the pedestrian traffic first, because that's, you know, not that there aren't a million cars that go through there a day, because it's a very busy street. But it seemed that was the appropriate thing to do there. We try to keep, if we can, in the city's core on main roads, we try to stay within a cement concrete sidewalks. As we get out into the outskirts, if it's more rural and everything is asphalt, we stay with asphalt. So there's a number of factors. There's a handful of 50-50 streets out there that you got to make a decision, like, do we do, you know, what's going to be the right decision in that case there. There are some guidelines, but at the end of the day, you got to see what the situation is on any particular road. So if you had any specific roadways, we could look at it and give you a better answer, but we generally replace like with like, whatever's out there. But if we're doing a whole-scale reconstruction, we make a decision as to, what's the right treatment for that. Particularly on side streets, it's probably going to be asphalt. It's a lot quicker, it's a lot less expensive. It's a great material, it provides an acceptable wearing surface.
Thank you. Or it sounds like a longer street, like Dodge Street, that was relatively recently redone. The sidewalks are largely asphalt, I think.
They are.
And so that sounds like, from what you're saying, I just want to make sure I'm understanding right, is partially financial, among other things, because that's a much longer treatment. Is that accurate?
It would be tremendously expensive to put in granite curb, and also because of the way Dodge Street we went from Nick's Roast Beef to the Wenham line, the way that road is laid out, I was able to achieve a certain width, and it was not quite wide enough for luxurious bike lanes, but we did put bike lanes on it. If we had put granite curb, that would have constricted the road, even though it would have been exactly the same width. If you have the Cape Cod berm like we have, a 4-foot bike lane is acceptable. If you have granite curb, you really need to have a 5-foot bike lane, because the bike is not gonna feel comfortable getting as close to the granite curb. So that's a decision there where it actually made the road more bikeable by not putting in granite curb.
Thank you. Thanks. That's helpful to understand how those decisions get made and how all those pieces come together. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any other questions from councilors for Mr. Collins on the, on public services? We also have enterprise funds to get to, but I want to take a quick moment to just sort of recap while we have the full council here, as well as Mr. Collins and the mayor and Mr. Perry, to mention the 2 meetings we had last week related to the cemetery, and the cemetery in particular, Central Cemetery, and the work going forward. So I know we had some discussions about moving forward with a master plan and trying to figure out how to get on common ground to take care of both master plan and addressing the plans for moving forward with a fence, which has been a long time perennial subject for me. And so I just want to acknowledge that I think we made some decent progress on our discussions, and I look forward to working with Eric Barber. I know he has made some commitments about how we can take where we are now, move forward, apply the $50,000 that's been allocated, and keep moving, making progress on that subject. So I'm looking forward to the delivery of the commitments that were made on that score. So I want to thank the mayor and you for your participation in those conversations and commitments. So,
and I do appreciate your patience and your passion on that topic. As we talked about, it's a beautiful spot, and it deserves to be polished into the gem that it can be. And we look forward to, through the master plan and through some other work, to realizing that. There's a lot we can do. There's a lot we have been, again, those things those systemic things that I talked about that are starting to bear fruit. There's a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes that we've been doing over the last decade that, again, and the cemeteries are not a very interesting thing to a lot of people. But we've put a tremendous amount of work into the program of cemeteries, and that is now, again, that's another area that is starting to come together for us on the day-to-day management of it. But there is no question there's an investment that needs to be, and I did try to put a number to the fence for you, and I think it's, if we had $750,000, we could complete the fence. So it's not an insurmountable amount of money. It's not $10 million. So, but at least that's a starting point.
okay, thank you. Yeah, we met twice last week. Mr. Barber and I have another meeting coming up either the end of this week or beginning of next week. So I'm hopeful that we are going to be able to move forward.
Well, definitely.
Constructively. So
Definitely going to. I'm confident of.
I'd like to ask our budget analyst, before we move on to the enterprise funds, to sort of give his own recap on the Department of Public Services and Engineering. And Mr. Perry, good evening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, and it's a good segue from our meetings. As you know, Finance and Property met last Tuesday with the Commissioner and Eric Barber, and went over a lot of capital expenditure projects that we were looking at and the status of them and things of that nature. We followed that up the 2 nights later, Thursday night, with the Chairman and myself, and again, Commissioner Collins and Eric Barber, and some of the other staff, I think, was there as well, as I recall. And we had a really good conversation, and then, quite frankly, after the meeting ended, and I want to thank Mike Collins, he gave me almost an hour and a half of his time late into the Thursday night to talk about a real lot of stuff about what's going on here and things of this nature. So I'd like to share with you, Mr. Chairman, a couple of just observations, if you will, just some thoughts for the policymakers. I'm glad the mayor's here to hear this a little bit too. But my observations are that we put quite a bit of challenge on Commissioner Collins and his staff with a whole bunch of things. Whether it's renovating this building, Cabot Street, all these capital expenditure projects, it's quite a bit put on them, at least in my observations. We even talked a little bit about, at least from my experience, it's very unusual. I'm not aware, maybe it's out there, but we've put into Commissioner Collins's management responsibility the janitors at the school system, which, from my experience, that's pretty unusual. But I think some of this is a testament, and I looked at him right in the eye, and he says he just likes to get things done, and I think he has that talent to get it done. But we have to, I think, sometimes step back and look at a few things. Are we putting too much on Public Works? And I worry a little bit about that in light of some of the projects coming down the road with the building here and McPherson Center and whatnot. If you net out the sanitation account there, which I did in my report, if you were to look at it, if you add up all the other public, I call them Public Works, Public Services, Engineering, Highway, Snow and Ice, Municipal Garage, Cemetery, Electric, Parks and Forestry, Public Property, we only went up $173,000. So the reality is, we have not, at least from my observations, put a ton of resources over the years, and that's somewhat similar to what you see in other communities. Public Works doesn't have a lot of people banging on the doors advocating, other than roads and sidewalks, it is to get things done. And so unfortunately, sometimes things fall by the wayside. What I did discover in our meetings last week with Chairman Houseman was, especially in the capital expenditure stuff, I had some sense that maybe they needed more resources to track this stuff, how much we've appropriated, how much we spent, what is the status of it, what's our game plan, and most importantly, which I've talked at great length with Mr. Ailes, can we claw back some of the unexpended funds to help us offset loans? So I think those are things that are going to have to be done. And I was tonight going to get up here and advocate they need more resources, maybe another FTE. But in a long conversation with the Commissioner, as well as Mr. Ailes about this matter, I supported fully the reorganization that he recommended to you, that you all supported, which I think is the right approach. It's been suggested, let's give it 6 months. Let's see if with the reorg that they can kind of get their arms wrapped around some of this stuff. And with the permission of the council, I'll certainly talk with the Commissioner and Mr. Ailes and even the Mayor if necessary to see if we can get our hands around it. But the bottom line to it is, as policymakers, I think we have to have some dialogue or some thought process as to whether they do need a little bit more resources if we're going to continue challenging the Commissioner and his staff with the things that we expect within the city of Beverly. And the other thing I'd like to add, there's been a lot of conversation tonight about roads and sidewalks, just from a monetary point of view. I have spent some time with the Commissioner's staff, specifically Eric Barber. We spent an afternoon, Commissioner Bowen and I, we talked quite a bit, and when I was looking at it, I think I've said this before, but I think it's really important to say it again. If you're going to properly finance roads and sidewalks in the city of Beverly, you need, in my opinion, based on my review, anywhere from $7 to $8 million a year to do the job. Let me repeat that. You need $7 to $8 million a year, in my opinion, to properly do the job. And we can't afford that. We just physically cannot afford it under the laws of Proposition 2.5. I have said that before. And as you know, they did cut it from 2.7 to 2.2, but the mayor has already got an order into you, the transfer of free cash. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks to at least get it back there. But you're going to always have this challenge, no matter how efficient the commissioner's office is, or how, we analyze this stuff, or no matter how you look at it, you're always going to be challenged. And in fairness to the city of Beverly, this is not unique. Every municipality in the country, forget this Commonwealth, in the country faces the same challenges. There's just not enough money to take care of roads and sidewalks in almost all the communities. So we do the best we can, but it's important. I think a lot of you already know this, but if the public is listening tonight, I hope they have some understanding of the challenges the administration and the city council has in trying to get that, because we're never going to have enough money to do the job properly. And I just thought that this should be said tonight, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Yeah, I do want to ask members of the subcommittee if they have any questions. I know Councilor Bowen has a follow-up question for Commissioner Collins. I would like to just follow up briefly myself first by saying that what I really heard from the meetings we had last week on sort of the management side and that you addressed in your initial comments this evening, I am fully on board with the notion that DPS needs additional staffing, just from a management point of view in terms of managing projects. It's up to the administration to decide whether that's something that they want to support. But I do hope that there are serious conversations about providing another full-time employee on the sort of project management side of things for DPS. So that's just my own 2 cents based on my observations from last week and our conversations. So, Councilor St. Hilaire, did I see you with a question?
Yeah, Mr. Perry, I just had a follow-up question on the road and sidewalks. You mentioned optimal $7 to $8 million. I think last year it was what, 2.7. Okay. Benchmarking in other communities, is there a benchmark? Where do we fall in terms of surrounding communities? And the other piece, do you think it was unusual for us to budget the way we did this year with the reduction in the road and sidewalks and having that be done as a cash transfer, or is that, do you have any concerns about us doing it that way?
Sure. So on the first question, do I have the data analytics to substantiate what other communities do? No, I don't have that in front of me. But based on my observations and just experience of doing this for a very long time, my experience tells me I think Beverly does a little bit better than other communities in general. I'm sure there are other communities that do better than Beverly, but I think a lot of them from even my own hometown, they don't do, in my view, as well of a job as the city of Beverly. So I'm comfortable that they're doing everything they can to get it done, but we can always do better. But it's again, you heard how much expensive it is. I don't know that stuff, but it's so expensive to do this, and it's just very difficult to come up with the funding. So that's that. With regard to your second question, that's a great question. It's kind of a philosophical, policy-driven. Keep in mind, a lot of the budget is kind of spoken for. We have fixed costs, whether they be health care or pensions or debt. We don't have a lot of flexibility in those line items, and we do have flexibility in this one. And, the administration recommended to cut it to have a balanced budget. Yeah, I mean, they needed to balance, in order to balance the budget, they needed to cut this or some other line item, some department head. I mean, that's, as we all know, how difficult that is. So there is some discretion there, but, the administration is trying to come back with some free cash, and I'm hoping to meet with the finance director at the end of this week to talk about that and some of those other transfers. But is it unusual? No. I've certainly seen that elsewhere. We are required by law to have a balanced budget. We could debate priorities. I mean, certainly the mayor has his priorities, and it's not much of a secret what some of those priorities are, but at the same token, the finance director, in my view, did a good job of balancing the budget, and at the same time, they're trying to be creative to at least put some of the money back on the table, if you will, to help with roads and sidewalks. So I do applaud them for balancing the budget.
Thank you.
Council President?
Thank you. Mr. Perry or Mr. Ailes, I think, could address this question. I know it comes up sort of perennially, but I think it's helpful just for the members of the public to hear it. But given that we never really will be able to keep up or to keep pace with what would really be needed as you said, in the budget, under the laws of Prop 2.5. Can you just talk a little bit about, either one of you or both, why or why not it makes sense or may make sense at some point to bond for a certain amount to do a catch-up year, or to put more money towards it one year? I don't know that bonding year after year, I think intuitively doesn't make sense. But is there any sense or wisdom, other communities do or do not follow that practice? To
That's a
do a
great
year where you could really put more into that line item by bonding?
I'm more than happy to start that, and then obviously Mr. Ailes can jump in if he likes. That's an excellent question. We have discussed this the whole 7 years I've been here. Under Chapter 44, Section 7 and 8, you can bond for this, up to, I believe it's 30 years. So the answer is, first, legally, you can do that. Other communities do it. Not all of them, but some, I'd say it could be as many as 50% of the communities will put bonds out. But it's important to understand, and I'm not a supporter of it given the way we do things here. When you go out to borrow for it, you got to pay interest, there's borrowing costs, and yeah, you could do a whole slog maybe at once, and there's two challenges with that. But then what happens is, 20 years from now, when none of us are probably doing this anymore, there's that dip here. The proper way, in my view, to do it is incrementally, a little bit at a time, not a big wad at once. And secondly, when you borrow for it, ultimately it costs the taxpayers more money, not less money, it's more money. And then finally, I'm sure the commissioner, I've heard him speak about this in the past, it's extremely difficult. Let's say you do a big one, 10 million, whatever you want to do, to get the staffing and the resources and the people to do it, and then the complete disruption that comes with a big, I know you've all received your complaints about the projects that are on the table now. Can you imagine if you did 5 times that amount there? So I think, in my opinion, as your budget analyst, the wise decision is to continue the path we're doing. If we can come up with more money, grants, you heard the mayor talk about, I thought it was 4.5, but 5 million, whatever it was. I mean, we had some extra Chapter 90, we had some grants, things of that nature. Some years we get a little bit more, some less. But my advice to you as your budget analyst is to stay the same path. I think it's in the best interest of the taxpayers, and I think it's the right approach. And maybe Mr. Ailes wants to speak to, that's my opinion.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I appreciate the dialogue around it. I think it's important for all of us to kind of understand how this fits into our overall long-term budget scheme, or plan, I should say. We put as much into roads and sidewalks every year as we can. We try to be efficient in our spending. We try to be thoughtful in how we're using the taxpayers' money. And at the end of the budget process, we put as much more as we can into roads and sidewalks. So last year, 2.7. This year, it'll be a total of 2.7, 2.1 in the budget. So if we were to borrow, let's say 10 million, to use Mr. Perry's example, we would have $10 million this year, and we would pave $10 million potentially more of roads. I say potentially because you got to line up the contractors and stuff, so you may not even be able to get it all done in a year. But you'd have 10 more million in resources. Well, to service that debt for the next 20 years, you would need to come up with an extra $1 million. So that extra $1 million would effectively take away from all that road and sidewalk money that we're able to push in, the extra money. So you'd effectively pay $20 million for $10 million now. And so in terms of our capacity and our long-term plan, it feels like a more value to the taxpayer to be able to spend the money in the year we have it, as opposed to trying to front load it and pushing the cost off to future years and potentially future generations.
Thank you. That's helpful. And just, I don't know, Commissioner Collins, I didn't know if you had a comment on that, or you're just returning to your spot.
No, I mean, I anecdotally, what I've seen is the communities that can afford to borrow have, at that time, relatively few other borrowing costs that are challenging them. So they might have a period, like we never have that. We never have that relaxed period. We're not building a school, building a building, police station, fire station. It's always something. And there are some communities where life is a lot more simple. There's no sewer systems. There's, just in the smaller towns. So I think that sometimes you will see borrowing, particularly in the smaller towns. That's just my very small sample size of what I've seen.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up comment. I think at the end of the budget cycle last year, I may even have said that one of the things that I thought we could consider, and so I appreciate that this is part of what we're considering, is because our own policy around free cash is that it's best to use it for one-time expenditures, not a recurring expense. Although roads and sidewalks and paving are recurring as a category, a road being done is not a recurring expense for the next, as you said, we'll get back around to it hopefully within 20 years. So I'm appreciative of that, looking at ways that free cash might be infused into that when we have it as a non-recurring expense. I'm supportive of that if it can help us to get a project done that would not otherwise be done, and without bonding, for reasons we just heard. So thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
And Councillor Bone, you had a follow-up question for Mr. Collins, I believe.
I did, thank you. And so I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole of individual projects, because I'm very appreciative that there are these conversations happening about how the reorganization and just, I guess, greater focus will help us have an ongoing conversation about the status of major projects and spending on them. And so happy to follow the next 6 months of that and see how things are going. But thought we would be remiss if we didn't just ask about one very public project or very visible project that's also fairly low cost, and whether there is funding or a timeline for the gazebo on the common to be completed.
Yeah, it's a bugger of a project, only because it's right in that spot where it's a little bit bigger than we can handle internally, but we don't have enough funding to do it right with a contractor, so we're trying to find the right fit for that. We worked with an architect over the last 9 months on a design, and that architect was gracious enough to do that for nothing for us, because as you know, the original gazebo was built by Rotary members, or at least in large part, and the Rotary has given the city a donation of $50,000 towards that. It's going to cost a lot more than that to do that, to rebuild it. What we discovered at the beginning of our design phase is that the original design was okay-ish. It was not built according to the original design. It is incredibly structurally deficient, so it's very unsafe, which is why we fenced it off once we started to open up and look at that. And it's just a challenge. Like I said, it's one of those, it fits into a weird spot with us, but we think hopefully in the next couple of months we can either tear it down and start over again, or trying to salvage as much of it as I can and rebuild particularly the bottom half. It's rotten. It's always wet. It's a kind of a shady spot. So we're trying to rebuild it with materials that won't require maintenance and won't be so susceptible to vandalism. So if you could bear with me just a little bit more, I think it'll be worth it. We're grateful for the help that we've gotten up to this point. But over the last couple of months, I've been trying to reach out to some local contractors to help us with, it's like I said, it's just, we don't have the right equipment to do some of the structural work. And so we're looking for a better approach for that right now. But I think, hopefully by the end of the summer, we'll be back up and running. That's my hope.
Thank you.
The next thing we really have this evening to discuss are our enterprise funds. And I would invite, before we jump into those, Mr. Perry, is there anything specifically or generally you would like to cover on enterprise funds before we jump into them?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in general, a couple things I'd like to comment with your permission, Mr. Chairman. All the enterprise funds, as I indicated in my opening commentary last week, all the enterprise funds are balanced in budget. They do require some transfer from retained earnings, as we discussed, to balance them. The water and sewer rates, as you know, are going up as well a little bit. And but in bottom line to it, they're all in balance. I'm comfortable with the proposal of the mayor. With your permission, if I may, Mr. Chairman, at this point, just one comment about the Airport Enterprise Fund. As you know, you as chair and your colleagues on Finance and Property asked me think it was last February, to take a management review of the airport to see what was going on as a result of, I think, one of the commissioners coming before you with concerns that he had with regard to various matters at the airport. That said, I wrote to you back on May 15th, two memos. One is confidential in nature. We really can't discuss it due to the potential legal negotiations, but the other memo had about 6 or 7 various management recommendations that I've suggested that the airport commissioners, the mayor, and everybody else consider, which you have, as you well know. I had an opportunity last week to, the council president and I discussed at great length this very issue. It's my advice to you that we have a new airport manager. I believe he started this week, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct, Brian? Did he? Yeah. And my suggestion to the to the council is to let's let the new manager get on board. Let's let the manager figure out where half the streets are or where the airport even is and things of that nature. And what I'm hoping to do, Mr. Chairman, is maybe after Labor Day, set up a meeting with the new airport commissioner, talk about some of these matters, and then sit with the council president. Maybe we'll have a conversation or a meeting or something along those lines to address some of those management recommendations that I have proposed. I think also roughly at that time, the confidential matter that involves legal negotiations may come before you for adoption as well. So it could the timing of all that may just work. So bottom line to it is, let's sit tight for the summer. Let's see where we're at in the fall, early fall, and maybe we'll have a better conversation at that time with regard to the airport. That said, Mr. Chairman, in terms of all the enterprise funds, I'm comfortable with them, and I'm sure the commissioner can answer questions about certainly the water and sewer at a minimum for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Collins or Mr. Ailes, who would you like to sort of lead the conversation about where the enterprise funds are and any issues related to them?
I think we can tag team. It depends on the enterprise fund, really.
Okay. All right. Is there any particular one you'd like to start with?
In my printout, water comes first.
Okay. Go ahead.
Is there anything particular you'd want to know?
Well, I'll ask members of the subcommittee if they have any questions about it, and if not, throw it open to the full council. I guess maybe you could describe for the listening public on BevCam. It may sound sort of self-evident, but perhaps you could describe exactly the function, the operating function of the Water Enterprise Fund.
Well, the Water Enterprise Fund fully funds the operation of all water functions within the city. So it's a separate budgetary process. There's little to no crossover with the general funds. We support the operation of the water department through the raising of revenue by water bills. So if that's where you're going with that question.
Well, yeah, and I guess the Salem Beverly Water Board is a separate entity from the city. Maybe you can just describe what, if any, relationship there is between the revenues and the expenditures in the Water Enterprise Fund and the operation of the
Sure.
of the Water Board.
On the water side of the world, we buy our water. The city of Beverly buys our water at a wholesale rate from the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board, which is a separate and distinct legislatively enabled body created almost 100 years ago by the state legislature, a little over 100 years ago by the state legislature. So even though the water board happens to live in Beverly, because Wenham Lake is, the terminus is in Beverly, and the filtration plant happens to be in Beverly, they're not us per se. I happen to be by statute and by position a member of the board of directors of the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board. So that gives us representation as well as the citizens rep from Beverly on the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board. But we buy our water. The Salem Beverly Water Board is responsible for water supply, so they find the water. Generally, our water comes from, some of it comes from the Ipswich River, some of it comes from the Longham Basin from rainfall, and some of it, a small amount of it comes from the Wenham Lake watershed directly. But a good chunk of it comes from the Ipswich River in the wintertime. We don't pump out of the river in the summertime at all. The water board doesn't pump out of the river in the summertime at all. So when things get really dry, we've already stored our water for the year and beyond. And the city of Beverly, that water is treated at Wenham Lake, put into a large 4 million gallon underground tank, and both the city of Salem and Beverly draw out of that and pump that finished water into their cities, their respective cities. At that point, we own the water. We're responsible for the safe handling of that water to the last free-flowing tap, as DEP likes to tell us. So we make sure that that water is safe for use throughout every part of Beverly, even private property. We have responsibilities on private property as well to make sure that the water is protected and safe for the customers. And the other side benefit of having a fresh water supply like that is fire protection. So our water mains in the city are sized not for drinking water, but for fire protection. It's a complicated, very well-engineered system that was designed around the notion that droughts are predictable. Droughts happen. We know they happen. We know what frequency they happen with. And we have a system that's designed around droughts, which is why we operate differently than all the other communities around us. Over the century plus that we've been in business as a water supply, that olive branch has been extended to our surrounding communities to partner up. At the first effort, that olive branch was extended to all the surrounding communities, and only Salem took that branch, and Salem and Beverly joined up, which is a great partnership and has worked out very well. And then the two communities continue to invest in building out a robust water supply over the last century, investing hundreds of millions of dollars in today's dollar value. And then a number of times along the city's history, we've extended that olive branch out to see if other communities would partner with us. Each time they've decided to go on their own. And we are again in that phase where we are trying to work with our communities on the North Shore to see if we can, if there's an opportunity for partnership. So a lot more to be said on that. There's an active working group that has been working since the drought in 2016 on some regional issues. We are mostly the solution to the regional issues. We don't have as much the regional issue that all of our surrounding communities have. But we are happy to be part of that if we can work together with our partners in the North Shore, and whatever we can do to help, we're committed to helping if it's possible.
You anticipated a question I had, which was, I have heard about regional efforts recently, especially after the droughts we had, last year, the year before, about surrounding communities and their concern that Beverly and Salem had no water bans, but many of them did. And so there certainly have been conversations that I've heard from my constituents about why are we using so much water when the other communities have water bans. So it is helpful to hear you say that there are conversations about regional cooperation on that, without sort of going into the weeds on that. I appreciate your comments in that regard.
Yeah, we have a wholly different system than everyone else because we plan, like I said, droughts happen. They're predictable. So we've designed around droughts, and because of that, when we have a drought, we're still okay.
Any members of the council have questions? Yes, Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one question about a specific line in the capital outlay portion of the enterprise fund budget. There's a pretty notable increase to $350,000 for water system improvements. Is that for meter replacements?
No, not specifically.
Could you maybe elaborate on what?
I'm sorry? Yeah, so things like Bridge Street, and the mayor talked about Hale Street. Mm-hmm. So we're looking to buy materials in advance of the Bridge Street reconstruction. Okay. We've been out there for the last year or so replacing services, and then we've got some main work that we'd like to do. We're trying to not hammer the residents of Bridge Street because, they suffered through a lot of gas work. They're going to suffer through a bunch of water work, and we're trying to tighten that up against the actual road construction work, which is scheduled to be bid out in September, and then probably start in the following spring, a year from now.
Okay, so the $250,000 increase is really tied just to those two specific projects, Hale and Bridge Street?
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
You all set?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Council St. Hilaire?
Just to follow up on the Hale Street project, which I'm very excited to hear about, any sense on timeline or what that's gonna look like?
I would say, we're probably gonna tackle Bridge Street first to try to get that done, because we have a, contractor that'll be breathing down our neck. But we're trying not to, like I said, we're trying not to drag the project out. We're not replacing all of Bridge Street, which is the two ends of it are smaller diameter. We're gonna bring those up. The main on Bridge Street is 12, there's two mains on Bridge Street, there's a 6 and a 12, 8 and a 12 in places. So when we're done, the whole street will be 12. But we want to get that done first, and then jump up to Hale Street.
Excellent.
Councilor Rand?
Thank you. My question is about the water construction permits line item. I'm just wondering if you can share any details of what you know might be coming online, or if the amount sort of allotted or anticipated are projects that are already happening and the permit.
If
haven't
it's on the
caught up.
revenue side of it, which I think that's what you're asking,
is,
on
yeah.
the revenue side of the budget, that is somewhat of a, I don't want to say educated guess, but it's a reasonable anticipated amount for permits yet to be pulled.
Okay.
So these are projects that we think might happen in the pipeline, and that's an amount of revenue that could reasonably be expected to be achieved if those projects all come to fruition. There are private projects that, depend on the economy not collapsing and all things like that. So it is as is a lot of the enterprise funds, it is an educated guess, because if we have an extremely dry summer, like last summer, we sell a lot of water, we make a lot of money. If it turns out it rains all summer, then people don't use as much water and the revenues fall short. So it's kind of interesting how that works.
And I'm actually glad, just one follow-up, I'm actually glad you just said that, because one of the things I struggle with, especially with this particular enterprise fund, is that it's dependent on us sort of not being conservative with our water usage, I guess, unless the fees change dramatically.
Well,
And
it's just,
I
all it
don't
means
love
is.
either of those scenarios, so I
No,
always struggle with it.
All it really means is that we're a year off, right? So if we have a massive conservation effort and we have less, then really it just means the rates have to change the next
Right.
year. So we just always have to adjust. It just means we're constantly in a mode of recalibrating our revenues versus our expectations. So it doesn't mean that it's an anti-conservation viewpoint or anything like that, or that we would incentivize water use, because the more we use, the more we buy. So it costs us money on the other end too. So there's no free lunch in this, and we are actively working in every way we can. The most effective way we have to reduce water usage is through leak detection, because that's where most of the water usage comes from. Most of the elastic water usage comes from. Our water rates are still quite low. They're very reasonable compared to the region. And until it becomes really expensive, of all the things all the bills that we all pay every month, the one that sustains life is by far the cheapest thing that we have in our stack of bills. At some point, if water became very expensive, then people would use a lot less of it. There's still a lot of discretionary water people could cut back on. So,
Yeah, I'm always looking for the middle ground of finding the way to incentivize cutting back on water usage without sort of egregiously impacting the rates.
it's tough because if we couldn't just randomly raise the rates, double or triple them, because then the Water Enterprise Fund would grow exponentially, and Bryant would be getting yelled at by the Department of Revenue saying you have too much money in your enterprise fund. So it is a balance, but.
But we could incentivize using less water.
The only thing that's really proven to be effective is make it expensive. So that doesn't mean other water conservation efforts aren't worth it, but the thing that really gets people to use less water is to make it expensive. It's very price elastic on certain aspects of it. You know, your household usage, that's not price elastic. You're gonna pay for that. It doesn't matter what it costs, you're still gonna flush your toilet and wash your clothes. But are you gonna fill the pool or water your grass if it's really expensive? Mm-mm. You know.
And that's, I mean, we've had this conversation for a few years now. I don't even like to say this, but that is why we visit the tiered system of water pricing, though some people think the tiered system should actually alleviate some of the cost of kind of luxury water use. But anyway, so just more food, water for thought for the future. Thanks.
As we work with our regional partners, you know, we may come back to the council, you know, because the types of numbers that are being thrown around for regional solutions, like the MWRA made a presentation recently, and they're talking multiples of billions of dollars, which is just not going to happen. So the regional solutions are incredibly expensive.
Thank you.
Counselor Feldman.
Thank you. I know this question has been asked before, but we continue to get asked about separate meters. And would you mind answering that question again of why Beverly does not have separate meters at the residential level and other communities do this, so would you mind?
Yeah, I mean, we did a thorough analysis of that. We hired a consultant to do a third-party analysis of that a few years ago, to just put some real numbers to paper on what it would mean. And, you know, a couple of things we learned in that process is that the communities that do have second meters, you're not seeing more communities have second meters, you're seeing fewer, so more are getting rid of their second meters as they go forward. And it's really, it would be a significant shift of expense onto the lower income users who don't have discretionary water use, who don't have grass, don't have pools and things like that. There would be, it has the effect of increasing the sewer rate, and one of our partner communities here saw that a few years ago. They do have second water meters, and quite a few people had them. But then a sudden and very expensive sewer project happened, $10 million sewer project happened, which was unexpected. That drove the sewer rate up even further, which then caused more people to get second water meters to reduce their water bills, which then made fewer customers, which then increased the sewer rates even further. So it's gotten to the point where the sewer rate has become very, very expensive. So it is also a way of, again, the price elasticity of water taken into account. If the net effect of second meters, as it's been proposed by the people who have been pushing it, is to make water cheaper for them. Therefore, they will use more of it, which is not something as a city that we support.
Thank you for that answer. I had one other totally separate question, and more of a curiosity in that, how much control does the city itself have in the process of purification of the water? And are there any, in that process, is it the city of Beverly or is it the Salem Beverly Water Supply Board that works on the purification? And if so, is there talk, or I know there's new methods of more sustainable and more environmentally friendly ways of purifying water and processing it, and I was just wondering where the city has control of that process, and if there's any talk of moving in those directions.
So we buy water wholesale. The city of Beverly buys water wholesale, so we buy it already finished. So as far as that is concerned, the city of Beverly is just a customer. The water board, because I'm on the board of directors on there, so I might have some inside knowledge on it. We're constantly looking at what is the most sustainable approach. Frankly, I'm not aware of any method of treating water that's really more basic and sustainable than we have. We have, you know, basic sand filters with an anthracite layer in them. So we're doing, there's a couple of things we do. We bring the water up into Putnamville out of the Ipswich River in the wintertime. That water looks like a cup of coffee when we pull it out of the river. high in tannic acid, high in organics. And we leave that water there up until about September. And in that time, the sun does a tremendous amount of the work for us. So we let the sun do a lot of our treatment for us. That's free. So the way that the board manages the water is, I believe, is probably the most responsible. Any other technology we would go to, osmosis, reverse osmosis, or membrane filters, or anything like that, would be very energy intensive and expensive compared to what we do now. So I think any other method that we use would be much more energy intensive. The treatment of water is an ever-changing landscape. The federal government is constantly changing the limits on the regulatory limits on certain pollutants. So that's something that we need to evolve to. And we know that as certain pollutants get identified, or the treatment limits get lowered, the detection limits get lowered, then we're going to be forced at some point into a total plant rebuild. And at that point, we'll have to see what the mandate is in terms of removing chemicals. What chemicals are going to be the focus of the EPA and the DEP at the time, and to see what technology is going to most effectively remove those chemicals. It's, you know, we know that a rebuild of the plant is in the not too distant future, you know, because it was last rebuilt in '74. So, but it's a tried and true technology. We have, you know, the most basic and straightforward technology for water treatment. It happens to be one of the things you read about a lot in the newspapers lately, in the national news, is PFAS. We just happen to have the best treatment. If you have a PFAS problem, which we don't, if you did, we already have the best treatment method built into our plant for removing PFAS. So, but if your water quality was something else, then we would need to adapt to that.
Thank you.
Councilor Rotundo?
Thank you. Commissioner, in regards to the Bridge Street project, which I know is ongoing, and coincidentally, I did get a couple of calls today because the construction work has stopped for now. You mentioned the water main being increased. The work that has been done, where you're just going property by property, that isn't the water main that's going to be increased or...
For a large portion of the street, there's two water mains, an old, smaller one, and a new 1960s. But it's in good condition, cement line, all the things that we like to see, 12-inch main. And we've been swinging the services over from the small main to the larger main, and also renewing those. We like to, as a practice, when we pave a road, as much as possible, we're not going to die on this hill, but as much as possible, we try to renew all of the water services that are still iron in the street, because they're going to leak. They were only meant to last 25 years, some of them 100 years old. So they're going to be a problem at some point, so we try to replace them up to the sidewalk as we pave a road, as a rule. So part of it is that, part of it is we're swinging them over to the larger diameter main. On the ends of it, from I think Winthrop down to the Hall-Whitaker Bridge, that's 8-inch. We're going to replace that with 12, so that when the bridge gets replaced, we can reconnect that and have another robust feed into Ryleside for fire supply. And on the far end, on the Danvers end, it also, from Cressy out to the Danvers line, it reduces from 8 to 12. So we'll be increasing that piece. And then the last bit of it is connecting each side street to the 12-inch main, because all the side streets right now are connected to the 8-inch main. So we'll be cutting in a T at each side street just to connect it over, which will have a benefit of, you'll have less rusty water, you'll have better fire flow, there'll be a lot that comes along with it.
Go ahead.
So, obviously, we're going to have more work before, it's got to be expected. And again, I want to be able to explain to people, listen, the roads are going to get worse before they're going to get better. That's just all the work that's getting done underground. So right now, the construction that has stopped, obviously the crew's working on other projects. I know you don't have a crystal ball, things can change. Do you have any anticipation or anticipated date that you may be starting up again, working your way around, working up the street?
Realistically, it'd be probably a couple of months, probably a month and a half to 2 months before we get back out there. We kind of know how much work it's going to be, and we're trying to not start it too early so that it's not just constant construction for the residents out there. We get it, we don't want to be out there forever. So if we can try to queue it up so that it works more seamlessly with the upcoming road rebuild. And then also, they're not living with as many trenches for as long a period of time. So we're just trying to manage it so it's not as impactful, and we're not wearing on nerves as much as possible.
As a courtesy, could you just, and you guys have been good, but I know things aren't necessarily easily communicated. Just communicate it out to me anyway, so I can
Yeah.
at least be aware that when I get the phone call, I can.
Yep, no, we'll keep
Right.
you close in the loop, you know. We've had a lot of communication with the neighbors, but sometimes, you know, the life of Bridge Street is a long one, and, you know, people, well, you know, they forget that we've reached out to them, you know, because
Yeah.
it doesn't seem like the same project anymore, because it's been a year.
Well, that's the
Seems like something different, right? You know?
That's the other problem. People are also looking and say, oh, it's the bridge itself. They're not, they're mixing the two projects up itself, the Bridge Street as well.
And you can't blame them, because, you know, you see the gas company out there for a year and a half, and, you know, that seems like separate and distinct, but they're all tied together, but they happen at different times, and they all have an impact on life in Ryleside. Or, I mean, as we went through on 1A, it was the same story. We did, you know, gas, water, did some sewer
I
work.
had a woman argue with me that she was having her house taken because you guys were out there looking, which was to do with the Bridge Street project. But she equated it that it was, because her house was closer to the bridge, that the state was taking her house by eminent domain. So that started going up there, so,
No.
thank you.
Any other questions, counselors, on the Water Enterprise Fund? If not, we'll move to the Sewer Enterprise Fund. Any questions about that? And Mr. Collins, I guess I would just ask you to sort of, as you describe the Salem Beverly Water Board as being a separate entity, maybe you could just sort of do a quick recap for anyone on BevCam about SESD and its connection and how it relates to the operations in Beverly.
Sure. Much like water, we are essentially a wholesale customer of sewage treatment services in Beverly. Rather than build our own sewage treatment plant, if you go way back in time, not that long ago, sewage in Beverly used to just go right into the harbor in a number of locations, particularly off Independence Park. That's where most of the city's sewage went. In 1925, there was the South Essex Sewerage District was legislatively established, and that was with 5 member communities: Marblehead, Danvers, Peabody, Salem, and Beverly. And those, well, actually, Marblehead was not an original member. Marblehead, up until the 70s, pumped all their sewage right into the ocean off of Marblehead Neck. So it's amazing how, you know, people don't think it wasn't that long ago when there wasn't sewage treatment in this part of the country. We saw it in Boston Harbor, you know. Anyway, so the SESD is housed at the beginning of Salem Willows or Winter Island, in that area off of Ford Avenue, and all of our sewage is pumped across at the end of Water Street from Beverly. It's all collected and pumped across the Danvers River into the SESD plant, and there it receives primary and secondary treatment, which is primary treatment really just removes anything that floats and anything that sinks, add some chlorine to it to try to disinfect it, and then the biological treatment happens in the secondary phase, where they introduce bacteria that eats the nutrients in the sewage. We don't want nutrients going out into the ocean causing algae blooms or red tide, things like that. So the hardest working member of the organizational chart at SESD is the bacteria, and they lead a very short life. So they eat and they die, and then what we call sewage sludge is brought out of the plant, but the sewage sludge is in fact dead bacteria. So the SESD is charged with treating the sewage and then discharging it off of Salem Willows, a part of the ocean called the Haste. And in our lifetime, that went from essentially screening out the car doors to very effective treatment, and the water that goes out is clear, pathogen-free, and is actually dechlorinated just before it leaves the plant, so the chlorine doesn't impact the marine life either. So it's a very robust treatment system that happens over there. The secondary plant was opened in 1998, and like everything, that environment over there is incredibly hostile to equipment. a lot of hydrogen sulfide, which then manifests itself when it mixes with water vapor into sulfuric acid. So it's a very caustic environment in the plant, and we're constantly replacing equipment and whatnot, but it's a incredible staff over there that does a great job providing protection, and it's a, as Eric Barber would tell you, because he left us and went there for 5 years, it's very difficult being at the bottom of the hill, because it just never stops. You can never take your foot off the gas over there. The plant staff is amazing, and they do a great job protecting the environment by doing the treatment they do.
Thank you for the quick description. Members of the council, any questions? Yes, Councilor Rand.
Thank you. This is, I remember it must have been, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 years ago now, where you actually arranged for us to have a meeting with the board. Not all counselors could attend, but counselors could attend, and then we took a tour. And I just would encourage you to set that up again now that
Sure.
sort of things are, life is normalizing a bit. I learned a lot on that tour, and it was good to sort of put a face to the board there.
Yeah, if you haven't been, I encourage any of the counselors who want to, it can be informal, you can reach out to us, you can come over when we have a board meeting, typically twice a month on a Wednesday, but this time of year, it's end of year purchase orders, things like that. So the meetings might or might not be as frequent. But I encourage you to come on over. It's a great take, and it's incredibly professionally run from top to bottom. So I think you can garner a lot of comfort from that tour.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's been a fair amount of change on the city council itself, and so an opportunity for a council-wide tour might make sense for us to arrange for the fall. If I don't hear any other questions on that enterprise fund, why don't we move to the golf and tennis enterprise fund? Yes. Yes, I think that makes sense. We were just discussing that up here. Yes, so let's move to the sanitation fund first, or next, excuse me.
If I could rewind my comments a little bit about our partners at the state, I want to just point out that our local representation is stellar and incredibly supportive of our efforts. There's just a couple that don't see eye to eye with us on Chapter 90. But overall, we've been very well supported by in case they're watching. I want to make sure. I just want to make it very clear that we have incredible partnerships, and we've been incredibly well supported with our local representation. We're lucky in this area.
Thank you. Would you like to just give a sort of a quick description for those watching of what the subject matter is covered by the enterprise fund, although it may seem somewhat obvious?
Yeah, sure.
Maybe it's not.
As the name might sort of imply, solid waste collection, disposal, and recycling collection and disposal for the city.
And a certain portion of the cost of that is carried by the general fund, and a certain part by user fees.
A significant portion is carried by the general fund, and there, somewhere I could hear retired Councilor Martin throwing a shoe at his TV as the notion of raising the trash fee was brought up. But yeah, there is a trash fee in place which helps offset a portion, an ever smaller portion of the total sanitation budget. But this is where that trash fee revenue goes.
Okay. Councilors, any questions or shoes that you would like to?
Mine are very cute. I won't throw them, though.
Well, seeing none, I guess maybe I knew there would be no questions. Why don't we move to the Golf and Tennis Enterprise Fund? And again, it's probably relatively self-explanatory and obvious, but why don't you just sort of give a quick recap as to what's covered by the Golf and Tennis Enterprise Fund and its function.
It's an effort by the city to keep the property cost neutral to the general revenue. So there's a contract in place with a service provider to operate the golf course and the function facilities and the tennis courts, and essentially rent that out from the city. Rent the property out from the city and pay us a continuous revenue stream. And we try to be a partner with them by helping invest wherever we can and keep the place. We have a great relationship with the current management. They're doing a great job trying to manage the course through some difficult weather challenges. And we've also gone through a significant planning effort on the clubhouse. Clubhouse is a beautiful historic asset. And we engaged in a design process to try to bring back some of the historic elements, improve the building, but do it in an environmentally responsible way. We've designed it with renewable geothermal heat source, but that's going to require a significant cash infusion at some point. So as a city, we've yet to figure out how to pay for something like that. But
Is the enterprise fund self-sustaining, or does it require any infusion from the general fund?
yeah, for the direct operations, it's self-sustaining. If we try to look at a major capital improvement to the building or the course, which we're not looking at doing anything major to the course, but that improvement to the building, we'd have to figure out a way to fund that, whether it be bond, because the revenue can't sustain even a significant bond. It's kind of chicken and egg, because if we did improve the building, it would be a better function facility, so they'd be able to rent it out more, it would generate more revenue, and we have worked with a professional to try to estimate what that additional revenue might be to see if the project is affordable, but we're still working through the inner workings of that.
Okay. Councilors, Councilor St. Hilaire.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess just to follow up on the clubhouse project. So I guess if it's a bigger project that needs to get done at some point, what is the nature of the improvements, the 105,000, and how are we deciding on that number? Is it just,
It's a little bit of triage.
yeah.
Because, they're just trying to keep ahead of leaks and plumbing problems, electrical problems, trying to
We're
keep.
not getting ahead on anything, we're just,
No. And we'd rather not, if we can avoid it, and we may not be able to invest, $150,000, $200,000 in a specific project there, because really the building needs a full renovation. It needs all new wiring, it needs new plumbing. The layout is not ideal, it's not original, and it's not optimal. So it really doesn't serve the historical purposes of preservation, and it doesn't serve the business purposes of being functional. So we tried to come up with a design for improvements that would serve both of those things, be a viable facility commercially, but it's also recognize the fact that we can't get rid of it. We're going to own it forever. We're obligated to keep it. So it is, in my opinion, an underutilized, undervalued city asset, and the renovation, I hope, if we can ever, at some point we'll be able to afford to do it. I don't know how, but that's for the magician next to me to figure out.
I agree with you. I think it's a very unique and valuable asset, so.
It could be more integrated in the community than it is.
Yeah.
I've actually never golfed in my life, but it's a beautiful place. I like to be there,
Okay, thank you.
Can I clarify something on that comment? I just want to clarify the numbers. You asked about the $105,000 capital outlay line. That's actually for course improvements. So they annually undertake, they've got a long-term capital improvement plan, just as we do in the city, that they try to work towards. It's course improvements, green improvements, irrigation improvements, and so they're looking to take on a few projects in the coming year. The clubhouse improvement line that Commissioner Collins was referring to is about $53,000, which is, like he said, just kind of the normal wear and tear kind of maintenance and repairs of the building.
Appreciate that clarification. Thank you.
But one of the cool things out of the clubhouse project came the idea of changing where the 18th hole is, and that's one of the improvements they're looking to achieve. It just made a ton of sense. It was just one of those things where the professional we brought in, it's like, why don't you just move it here? And we're like, makes a lot of sense, and it'll make the course a lot more playable and enjoyable.
Any other councilors' questions regarding that enterprise fund? If not, we'll move to the airport enterprise fund. I know Mr. Perry has already discussed that a little bit with us. Again, probably self-explanatory, but Mr. Collins, if you want to say a few words about what happens for the enterprise fund, where the monies come from and go to, just sort of.
Yeah, I mean, Brian's probably, we've had a lot of involvement in the airport, but I'll let Brian take this one.
Yeah, in terms of the numbers, certainly Commissioner Collins has involved a lot of the operations up there and kind of the projects and the maintenance needs and stuff. But in terms of the numbers, I can probably provide some insight. The major sources of income for it really rely on the operations. The landing fees are a significant portion. They comprise about $350,000 of the 580 or so thousand that we're budgeting in revenues. The other, I'm sorry, that's lease income. So that's the leasing of the hangars, tie-down leases, things of that nature that we receive revenue for, $350,000. The landing fees comprise about $130,000 of the total revenue. And then the third largest revenue stream is the fuel and oil surcharge. For every gallon of fuel or oil that's dispersed on the property, we receive a portion of that into the enterprise fund. And then those funds, in turn, are utilized to support the operations of the airport. We have staff up there. We have a building to maintain. We have airfields to maintain, lawns to mow, wildlife to manage, fencing to manage.
Okay, thank you. Questions from members of the subcommittee for Mr. Ailes? I have one question that relates to a surcharge for, or a tax, I'm not sure what it is. Been some discussion about leaded fuel that's used for some of the aviation, some of the airplanes, and whether or not that might be a potential source of income for the city going forward.
So avgas or jet fuel?
Pardon?
Avgas or jet fuel? They're
Jet fuel.
Yeah. There is the opportunity for a jet fuel surcharge. We're investigating it with our legal department. We've had conversations with the Department of Revenue. Mr. Perry's been involved in some conversations internally with both myself and the solicitor's office. The plan at this point is to let, as Mr. Perry mentioned, our manager get his feet wet, at least give him a couple days on the job before we hit him with this piece to manage for us. But there'll be more forthcoming with that.
Okay, great. Council Feldman.
Yes, thank you. Building 45. I understand we do want to let the new manager get his bearings. But this has been going on for several different managers, and I'm not sure to what level it is even their responsibility at this point. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but where do we stand with Building 45 and the city's responsibility?
So let me touch on the funding of that first, and maybe if you just want to kind of talk about the work that's been done by Mike's team at a tremendous cost saving to the airport. Anyway, the funding that has been allocated for the project was roughly $250,000 that was transferred over to a capital project fund, probably about 7 years ago or so, somewhere in that range. In addition to that, the airport put about 130, 140, this is off the top of my head, so I'm using round numbers, 130, 140,000. Commissioner Collins and his team spent about 250 of that. To do the renovations that have taken place so far. So the full re-siding, you should have seen it. I mean, it was down to basically the concrete pylons that held up the building, and everything was ripped out in between. All the new electrical feeds, I said the siding, the roof, there was asbestos abatement. Significant work was done. There still remains in that capital fund about $120,000, $130,000. What? How much? 111. And so that is available to put towards any next phase of the project that the Airport Commission deems fit. It is Airport Commission money, Airport Enterprise Fund money, but it needs to be used for Building 45 unless there's a council action to return that money back to the Enterprise Fund for another purpose. So that's kind of the financial totality of what's going on out there, but I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure, I mean, the immediate need that we had up there was, at the time, we had planned on putting in the police detectives, because they're in Memorial, and the building inspector's office, because they're also in Memorial Middle School, and we were going to be tearing that down to renovate it. So that was the immediate need. So we embarked on a project to restore the building. The Airport Commission had decided to tear it down. We looked at it, and the building was square and plumb, and in a good solid building, so we thought it was worth keeping. I also have a soft spot in my heart for an old Navy building, so we'd like to do what we can to preserve the asset. And the amount of money that they had allocated wouldn't actually have paid to demolish it, even because there was so much asbestos in the building, as you would expect any military building to be almost made entirely of asbestos, it seems. So some money was appropriated, and we set about making some structural improvements to the building. The building had been leased out by dozens of different tenants who had had their way with the building, just cutting holes in walls and cutting out structural members. So we did a lot of repair work to that. There was an amount of money came out of our budget, Public Services budget, and there was an amount of money that was set aside by the Airport Commission with a specific menu of things that it was to be spent on. So that money, that 111 that's still there, is really meant for when we finish. We've basically break the building into 3 pieces. The piece where the detectives ended up is completely done. It's 100%. It was occupied for a number of years by the detectives and then vacated when the new police station was completed. The next half of that barracks section is fully renovated, insulated, roughed in, HVAC done, electrical rough, data and teleco roughed in, and insulated and sided, waiting for. It was going to be the building inspectors, but in the meantime, the city opted to instead put them in the GAR hall rather than up there. So we stopped at that point because we felt that we didn't want to pigeonhole whatever future use it might have into whatever wall configuration we might come up with. It didn't make sense to go any further with a renovation of that middle third of it at that time. And then the last piece of it, the old dining hall where the restaurant was, is where some of the worst structural defects were. We fixed the foundation, and we have plans to continue. We're going to rebuild the floor in there, change the windows out. They're all single pane windows, and rebuild the deck on the front. But we essentially ran out of money on the city side of it, and the things that the Airport Commission obligated that money for would probably use up all of the remainder, that 111,000. So we need to fund, if we're going to do anything up there, it needs more money or it needs more effort, needs more money from the city side or from the airport enterprise side to do everything that needs to be done to it. But by the same token, a lot of this, we were working with the airport on an RFP for a restaurant up there. They put out an RFP, maybe even 2, and received no responses. I don't know why. You know, they thought they had some very viable candidates up there. This is going back a few years now, but they thought they had some very viable candidates. But I think the wind got taken out of everybody's sails when they did try to get some tenants up there and were not able to secure any tenants. So
when you say more money, how much more money are we talking about in terms of, and would the condition of the building as it is now affect anyone's, the ability to RFP successfully?
Right now, you could rent out the building or lease out the right 2/3 of it, the barracks section, the long skinny section, because part of it's done. So if it suits somebody's needs, it's walk-in ready.
Mr. Collins, if I may, I know Mr. Perry has done a fair amount of work on the airport, and I wonder if he might be helpful in elaborating on this question in terms of what we can and cannot talk about, and
Sure.
as well as the background.
So, Counselor, a couple things. I think I shared this with you privately one-on-one. There are some really, in my view, wonderful opportunities that could occur up there. I really believe that. We do need to do some more work. We touched upon briefly the jet fuel exercise. We're doing some homework on that. And there's some research. We're going back in some city records, so it's going to take some time. But there is an opportunity, in my view, to get this jet fuel exercise up and running, which will generate more revenue back to the airport. In some of my conversations I've had up there, I did spend a morning up there with some of the commissioners, and Commissioner Collins is right, the restaurant thing didn't really work out, but there are other opportunities for rental opportunities in these facilities, businesses that want to do work up there. I think the biggest problem, from my observations that I observed, we just really didn't have the right leadership, not in the past, but we've had turnover, as you may recall from my memos. I've had some turnover with the airport managers up there, and I'm hoping with the new manager that we can take some steps and move forward. I really think some really cool stuff could happen over the next couple of years, but I think we need to be a tad patient. Let's, again, as I indicated earlier, let's give the summer, let's the new manager get there. I am giving you personally my commitment that after Labor Day, I'm going to go meet with this manager. We're going to sit down, we're going to talk, and then we're going to all huddle up and see if we can get a game plan going. But I do believe there's some great opportunities there. So what happened last winter with one of the commissioners coming here, I think, was the impetus to get things going and things moving. And I hope you can stay tuned. I think good things will happen.
And I had heard about Building 45 prior to that,
Right.
because of being in the ward. So I would appreciate being included in any conversations.
Absolutely. I walked through the building myself. I saw what some of the things that Commissioner indicated. It's a big shell. It's empty. They kind of fixed the foundation, things of that nature, but it's certainly not ready for anything. So I'm really pushing hard as your budget analyst this jet fuel excise issue. And if I'm right and we can make something happen, I think we can do some more stuff there. So hopefully, I promise you I'll keep you in the loop in this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any follow?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're good. So that is the discussion on the enterprise funds. Mr. Ailes, we have in the digital budget book in fund summaries, we also have the stabilization fund, which is not per se an enterprise fund. But I wonder if you do want to say a few words about that, if for no other reason than to sort of round out what is in the digital budget book as an explanation of funds and their summaries.
Sure, I'm happy to say a few comments about the stabilization fund. You know, back when I first started my work here, going on a decade now, the city had a stabilization fund. I believe there was about $750,000 in that stabilization fund. And the then fiscal year budget 2014 called to transfer another $250,000 into that fund, and we did so. And so that started the concept and the review and the analysis around stabilization fund, why it's important, what it can do for the city, what it can do for the taxpayers, providing stability, stabilization fund. And so at that point, we worked collectively, and Councilor Houseman, you were a big part of this conversation, around developing policies that made sense for the city. And so we did a fair amount of analysis on the structure of Beverly's revenues. Every city or town is different. They rely on different sources of revenue to differing levels. In Beverly, our largest revenue source is our tax base, roughly 80%. The next largest revenue source is state aid. And when you look historically back at recessions, state aid gets impacted. And it typically gets impacted, in Beverly's case, up to 25% reductions over more than 4 years. And so when you start tallying up the value of these revenue sources, which are volatile in economic swing times, it became very clear on what an appropriate target in terms of stabilization fund balance should be. And so the policy calls for a 10 to 15% of general fund operating budget. And that's based not only on how state aid reacts during recessions, but also how other economically tied revenue sources such as meals tax, room tax, excise tax, building permits, new growth, all of those things get affected when the economy starts constricting. And so we want to be prepared to continue to deliver a quality level of service that our residents are used to and expect of us through those economic times. I will say kind of one kind of highlight of the pandemic from my seat is that we actually tested this theory when the pandemic first hit, and we thought that there would be some erosion in some revenues. We were able to model, based on our stabilization fund balances, how to get through a 4 to 5 year economic downturn with tightening of state aid and tightening of these other volatile revenue sources, and we produced a model that allowed us to effectively get through a 4 to 5 year pandemic where revenues were tightening and continued to deliver levels of service. So even though the target's 10 to 15%, right now we're just a hair over 11% in terms of our fund balance. Every year when we certify free cash, you're all aware, one of the first orders of business that the mayor does is he comes before the city council requesting 10% of the free cash certification be transferred into the stabilization fund balance. And what that does is that allows the stabilization fund balance to keep pace with the increasing, sorry, I might have gone backwards by mistake here. That allows the stabilization fund to keep pace with the increasing general fund budget each year. And so you can see here what we've done from FY13 and where we are now in FY23. The top part of the chart that's in green represents the target zone. So you can see we're slightly below about the halfway point of our, the middle of our target zone. So there's still some work to do. But again, what this does is this allows the city to have additional resources when the revenues begin to erode, because they will. It's cyclical. We will have another recession, and when we do, we have a plan B and a plan C with the stabilization fund in place, and we're able to use that in conjunction with other cost-cutting measures that can get us through a recession without too much pain. And I will, just as a point of recollection, I can remember when my wife and I first moved here to the city. We were just starting a recession a couple of years into us moving back here, and one of the major discussions was about closing schools and layoffs, and that was a difficult discussion for the community to have. It was a result of the city going through a recession without a stabilization fund, and some concessions had to be made, and they were difficult ones for some neighborhoods. So happy to answer any questions about this, but we included it in the budget book because it is an important part of our financial stability within the city, even though we're not tapping it this year for any budget purposes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think if we have any follow-up questions on that, that might be appropriate for the public hearing on the budget, which we have on Tuesday, June 13th. Having said that, we have covered all the items on the posted agenda for this evening's discussions. So unless there are any other sort of general conversations about public services or enterprise funds, I would entertain a motion to adjourn committee of the whole.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
And a motion to adjourn finance and property.
So moved.
I will second that. All those in favor? Aye. We are adjourned for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you.